Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to tonight's Fiveable Cram session. Hey, Gianna and all of these folks here. Carter wants to know what's Tom dabbing. Since this is a members-only premium session, I'm not even going to make you wait for it, ladies and gentlemen. Let's go ahead, dab. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with a dab. Okay, so we've got that. We got that out of the way. And so we see some things here. Okay, well, thank y'all. Thank y'all. Y'all are making me feel very important right now. So, yes, I have arrived and all of that good stuff. So, yes, I am here. Hydration is key. Okay, you got to stay hydrated. And we've got that exam tomorrow. So, yes, okay. So, y'all want a dab. It's like y'all don't want a review. Y'all just want a dab. Okay, so that's I see how it is. Now, all I have to do is the whoa, okay? Now, I think before I do the whoa, then I'm going to wait till, remember when we get to talking about the Treaty of Whoa, okay? Y'all saw that on Twitter. Okay, y'all want one more dab before we get started? Okay, so one more dab. All right, so Tom Gadier T, where am I? Okay, so where am I, right? So you're asking me, where am I? I'm here. Okay, so going from that, okay, so ladies and gentlemen, let's see what we've got going on. We've got some questions here, and let's see. So we've got tons of stuff, and we see the most upvotes here, the Crimean War, okay? Yes, remember that tomorrow on your exam, just go ahead and write either, let's get this bread. Okay, is the default. Now you write it somewhere on your DBQ/LEQ and then put a line through it. Okay, let's get this bread, or obtain the grain, or yeet the wheat. Okay, that's another one. So let's get this bread, obtain the grain, yeet the wheat. Hey, Jillian. So as far as that goes, yes, that's going to be happening. Now, the Crimean War, okay, is having to do with Crimea, all right, which is the an area which today is claimed by both Russia and Ukraine. Russia is occupying that in defiance of international law. But as far as that goes, that Russia has always had a stake in Ukraine, okay, as far as an interest in Ukraine. And so as far as that the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, so to speak, the Crimean War, you want to know that's a balance of power war, okay, that the British and the French, when Russia is trying to move in on this territory, which had been, which had traditionally been the territory that belonged to the Ottoman Empire and other allies, the British and the French are like, no, Russia, you can't go in there. Okay, you can't go in there. We're going to oppose you. So basically, you've got Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire versus the Russians here. Okay, so the thing is that when we're looking at the Crimean War, we want to understand that's happening around the 1850s. So this is really the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution, whereas World War I is the culmination of the Second Industrial Revolution. The Crimean War is, kind of like the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution. So you want to note that it's a modernizing war. That what happens here as a result of the Crimean War, the British stopped selling military commissions. Okay, that before the Crimean War, it was still in a situation where the British where if you wanted to get a certain rank in the British military, a certain officer rank, then you had to, in order to do that, you had to purchase the commission. Now, what happens, though, is you end up with, a bunch of aristocratic idiots who are there because they paid and not because they were the most qualified people, okay? So they paid to get there. They were not the most qualified people. And so from that, the Crimean War, we see that modernization. And remember the charge of the Light Brigade, Alfred Lord Tennyson's charge of the Light Brigade, cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered into the Valley of Death. Rode the 600. So you've got this cavalry charge going into this like heavily fortified position. And so with that, yes, Anna Mitra, nice seeing you. Let's get this bread, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so with that, just a quick review of the Crimean War. The Prague Spring in 1968. Now, the most important thing, it's funny how I keep getting the same questions every review, but a lot of people want to hear this, okay? So as far, you're going to go into the Valley of Death tomorrow, but you are going to survive because you have been, you've been preparing for this exam. So the Prague Spring, we want to associate that. Remember, Prague's in Czechoslovakia. Hey there, Tejas. Prague's in Czechoslovakia, which was part of the Eastern Bloc. These were these countries that were part of Stalin's sphere of influence. So Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. These were countries that were in the Eastern Bloc. So Czechoslovakia was, they put this guy as the president who was somewhat of a liberalizer. He wanted to reform some things. What he called, I think, like socialism with a human face or something like that, if I'm not mistaken this. And so what happened was the Soviets decided that this is not somebody that we want in charge. This is not somebody that is always going to do the bidding of the Soviet Union. And so the Soviets send troops in response to this. Now, remember, 1968 is the year of the Prague Spring and also the year of various like student protests in France. And I'm not really that familiar with student protest in France, only that they happened. Okay. So when you consider that, like just, it's one of those things, you don't have to get too deep into that, but knowing this is going on, 1968 is a big year. Also the year where the Vietnam War is kind of reaching its peak in the United States, if you want some additional context. But the Soviets sent in military forces in order to put down this liberalizing movement, and that basically created the justification for what we know as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Okay, the Brezhnev Doctrine, whereas the Truman Doctrine, if you run into that is, where the United States is saying that we will not let another nation become communist, that we will stop the spread of communism. Well, what happens here is that, Brezhnev says that the Soviet Union will not allow, any of these countries in the Eastern Bloc to be taken over by forces that are hostile to socialism. Okay, not anybody that's hostile to socialism. And if it threatens the unity of the socialist world, the Warsaw Pact, then it threatens all socialist countries, and therefore it is it is something that is a matter for the Soviets. Okay, and so so the Prague Spring, the Soviets did away with this liberalizing movement in Czechoslovakia and made clear. So the Brezhnev Doctrine makes clear that any of the Eastern Bloc countries that tried to institute a regime that is hostile to the Soviets, they are not going to the Soviets aren't going to just sit there and stand for it. Now, the other thing is we want to note that as far as that goes, let me just make sure I've got my train of thought, that Gorbachev renounced the Brezhnev Doctrine. Okay, so we want to note Gorbachev's renunciation of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which led, of course, to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so with that, that's basically the Prague Spring. Okay, let's get this cake. Let them eat cake, right? All right, so what are the most commonly skimmed over topics by students when reviewing for the exam? That's something that I'm not exactly sure I can answer that, because it's always going to be like, somebody's going to skim over something and other people are going to skim over things. Now, the other thing that we want to note here is that, every year the exam, let me make sure that we're talking about the exam. This exam is not going to be comprehensive, okay? That you're going to study what you're going to study, and every year the exam is different. Now, the old exam had 80 multiple choice questions that asked like 80 distinct questions. They're like asking about different things. So the multiple choice tended to be a pretty comprehensive coverage of the material. Whereas when we're looking at the exam now, 55 multiple choice questions, but they're stimulus based, and so you have like groups of like 3 and 4 questions about different topics. And so when you think about, you've only got maybe about 12 to 15 topics that are assessed in the multiple choice. 3 topics that are assessed in the in the short answers, 1 topic assessed in the DBQ, and 1 in whatever LEQ you pick, that you're really only showing your mastery of probably less than 20 topics, you see. So that's something that, it's not a comprehensive exam, it's very random. So when it comes to that, what I tell students is that, think about, when you're thinking about what to study, think about something that you're not necessarily that strong in, and go from there. But something you're not strong in, but that you're kind of interested in, like you're like, you know what, I'd like to know a little bit more about that. And I think that that's important, because if you're picking things that you're that are going to put you to sleep, then you're not even going to you may not get out of this whole session here if you're just going to look at things that bore you. So I tell students, don't look at something that bores you. Like if you're like, you know what, that Louis XIV guy, like I think that I'd like to know a little more about him, and I'm kind of shaky on that, then do that. But don't spend tonight looking at things that are going to put you to sleep unless it's time to go to sleep. Then you can start looking at like family structures in the 17th century and, yada, 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 that kind of stuff, you see? And so as far as that, we're going to go ahead and, wow, Joseph's got like a Harry Potter, like wizarding photo. What in the world? Like it animates. I didn't realize you can have animated, like, Harry Potter kind of things here. Okay, so with that, a 30 Years War overview. Now, I would caution you against, okay, what I would caution you against is oversimplifying this. Like last year, it was the DBQ. Now, it probably won't be the DBQ again this year. But what we want to note is that there are some topics it might be good to go ahead and watch my 15-minute video, okay? And so with that, we have to think about the 4 phases of the 30 Years' War. Now, first of all, the context is the Protestant Reformation and in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, what had happened is Bohemia. Now, remember the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 had said, whoever reigns his religion. So whenever we're dealing with when we're dealing with the Peace of Augsburg, like, whoever reigned in an area, his religion. Now, what had happened was that Bohemia was largely Protestant, but it had a Catholic ruler. Typically, I think the Habsburgs administered that personally. But what had happened is there was kind of a de facto religious toleration in Bohemia because they were predominantly Protestant. So you know what? Leave them alone. And what happened was that Ferdinand took over as emperor, and he revoked what was called the Letter of Majesty. He revoked, this understanding that the Protestants would be tolerated. And of course, that starts the revolt, leading to the unforgettable defenestration of Prague, right? It's like, who can forget that? Who can forget the defenestration of Prague? And so that is kind of the first episode here, and that is beginning the Bohemian phase of the war. Now, the 30 Years' War starts as a local conflict within the Holy Roman Empire that is largely about religion, okay? So a local conflict which is largely about religion. And so with that, we want to note here that it is going to expand, okay? So the Danish phase, the Danes are Protestants, okay? The Danes are Protestants, and they are getting involved in the Danish phase. Now, the Catholics, okay? The Catholics do very well in the 2 early phases, okay? The Catholics do very well in the 2 early phases. And then you start to see some more foreign intervention. Now, the Danes don't do that well, but then we see the second half of the war, it becomes more continental and political. So it begins as local and religious, and it ends up becoming continental and political. So you have the Bohemian phase and the Danish phase, and then you have later the Swedish phase and the French phase, okay? So the Swedish phase and the French phase. And so what time period? I'm talking about the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. Now, stop that, okay? Stop, okay? Let's think about in terms of like actually like thinking about the, the time period there. Quit talking about period 1, period 2, period 3, period 4, or whatever. I mean, think about this. 1618 to 1648, that we're talking about the late Reformation, okay? Now, technically the end of the so-called period 1, but who talks like that? Numbered periods will never be on your exam. Your exam will never ask you about a numbered period, but it will ask you about the Reformation era, okay? So you should know something about the Protestant Reformation, but I'm just, I want to make that clear, okay? Why did the Danish get involved? They did get involved, okay? Yeah, Ariana, I didn't come up with it, but one thing to note is that when it comes down to it, the exam never mentions numbered periods, okay? And so you want to think in terms of this is about the Reformation, and this is the age of religious wars. Oof, okay? That, yeah, you will never see a reference to a numbered period on an AP exam. But do note that when we're thinking about the end of the Reformation era, okay, and that's what the so-called period one is about, the Renaissance and Reformation. So just get the numbers out of your head and start thinking in terms of like, okay, 1648, besides being a turning point on a numbered period, that what's happening here is that 1648 is the end of this Reformation era, okay? So you've got the Swedish phase and the French phase. Now remember, the French have already been through their own wars of religion. So the context here is the French have already been through their wars of religion, and so the French are going in the direction, remember, the French monarchy embraced politique, okay, or what some of my students have called before politicue, okay? So politique or politicue. And so with politique, like this idea of politique is that the nation, that what's best for the country politically should be more important than religious concerns. So when we have a conflict between religion and politics, we're going to choose politics. And so the French had done that, and they had learned that. Remember, Henry IV, Paris is worth a mass, Edict of Nantes, okay? So as far as that goes, that France, when the Swedes, intervened, the Swedish phase, now Gustavus Adolphus was killed in battle, and the Swedes started to kind of back off as far as direct military intervention. And the French come in, okay? So the French come in from that point, and the French, we see that the French phase, where the French come in now, Gustavus Adolphus had some political motives, but he was on the side of his own religion. The French come in, and it's like, whoa, okay, like, I mean, the French come in, it's like, whoa, these Catholics are coming in on the side of the Protestants, and that's Cardinal Richelieu, okay? So Cardinal Richelieu can be described as a politique. He was a Catholic cardinal, but he's like, look, I'm going to do what's best for France. And so going from there, we see that the French getting on the side of the Protestants, it has lost this whole religious war thing, this local religious origin of the conflict, and it is now becoming a fully like continental and political war, okay? So as far as that goes, we want to note that we see that with the Peace of Westphalia, we see the end of the Russian, we see the end of the era of the Reformation. And so it is, we see that, let's see, what is it we see? All right. So there will never be another continental war that's primarily fought because of religion. And we see that the Holy Roman Emperor ends up losing power. There's still a Holy Roman Emperor, but remember Voltaire says later, that the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And then there's also the freedom of private worship, okay? The freedom of private worship, which now, even if the prince is Protestant, if I want to practice Catholicism in the privacy of my own home, then I can do that. And then so now remember also that the princes in the Holy Roman Empire can now choose between Lutheranism, Catholicism, and Calvinism. So they've got three choices now rather than just two from the Peace of Augsburg. And that's kind of setting up the Hohenzollern, the Fredericks, of Prussia, because the Prussian monarchy, they were Calvinist, even though the people they ruled were predominantly Lutheran. And so remember also that another legacy of the 30 Years' War is France is set up to become the preeminent power in Europe, okay? And so advances in consumerism throughout European history. Okay, so when we think about consumerism, all right, so first of all, let's note that when we look at, when this course started, the age of exploration makes luxury goods cheaper. Okay, so for example, if we were doing this 500 years ago, and I like all of a sudden I'm like, hey, watch this, and I take a jar of cinnamon out of my pocket, and everybody's like, whoa, or actually, wait, not whoa, everybody's like, whoa, like look at that cinnamon. All right, what's going on here? And so they might want to defenestrate me and take my cinnamon, right? Because it was so it was such a big deal. But then now with the age of exploration, with all water routes to China and India, what we see happening here is that all of a sudden, like, everybody's got cinnamon. All right, so okay, so yes, here is my all right. All right, there's Caroline. Everybody say hello to Caroline.
Hi.
All right, so hi, you have to say hey to everybody. Say hey.
Hi.
Hi. Okay. So as far as that goes, we've got that. Okay. So, all right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I always love it when Caroline is in the building. Okay. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going from there. All right, so consumerism. Okay, so you see a rise in consumerism there. Now, the price of luxury goods goes down. Okay, the price of luxury goods goes way down. But then as consumerism starts to pick up, you have the price revolution. So remember that as a result of the age of exploration, okay, as a result of the age of exploration, what we see there is that the price of these luxury goods goes down, but then we start to see in terms of the consumer goods. More people want consumer goods, and so the price revolution is something where the price of consumer goods starts to go up. Now, the Dutch, for example, were a great, consumer society. They started, the middle class started consuming art. And that's why the art of the Dutch Golden Age, it's largely middle class people working. That it's not, it's not middle class, it's not like upper class aristocrats and stuff like that. But it's middle class people who are working, and they are actually, they're painting themselves doing work, or having other people paint them doing work. And so we start to see like middle class consumption. And so there's something that that some historians note. We talk about the Industrial Revolution, but then there's also the what they call the Industrious Revolution, where people are more willing. Okay, people are actually willing to work harder so that they can afford, so that they can afford consumer goods. And so going from there, okay, so going from there, we want to, get to the next phase of this. We also want to note imperialism. There is another connection between imperialism and consumerism. So when we look at the new imperialism, that is something that we're starting to see, like people are wanting to buy exotic goods. And so you see another increase in consumerism because of imperialism. So a few of those things. So yeah, those questions are tough, but there we go. All right. Can I go over the major events of the Bolshevik Revolution? Okay. Now, as far as the Russian Revolution in general, we always get a lot of questions about that. Okay. So a lot of questions about the Russian Revolution. And so first of all, we want to note that that the Russian monarchy was starting to, now Alexander II, okay, Alexander II was czar in the 1860s, and he was a liberalizer. Like there were attempts to try to liberalize. Alexander II was responsible for liberating the serfs, also responsible for like the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So he was open to industrializing. And of course, once he was assassinated, the czars got a bit more reactionary. And Russia was having some problems. For example, the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-1905. This was something that was a bit of a crisis for the Russians because their Pacific fleet was destroyed, and then they sent their Baltic fleet over, and that Baltic fleet was defeated by the Japanese, and finally they lost that war. And this was the first time that a European power had lost a war to a non-Western Western power. So Japan really, and kind of the irony here is Japan was taking the advice of Peter the Great. Japan was westernizing in the late 19th century. Hopefully, Terry, you have been learning this before tonight. But if you're starting to learn 500 years of history in one night, then best of luck to you. Best of luck to you. And so with that, the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War is a big deal. Now, the 1905 revolution, two things from the 1905 revolution. First of all, Bloody Sunday, that there was a workers' protest in St. Petersburg on this what's called Bloody Sunday because Tsarist troops ended up firing upon this crowd and killing a lot of people. And in response to that, there was a lot of popular outcry against the Tsar, and Nicholas issued the October Manifesto. Now, we don't want to get this confused with the October Revolution, okay? We don't want to get this confused with the October Revolution, because that could be that could be an issue there. But the October Manifesto, that's where Nicholas II was promising a state Duma. So we saw a constitutional monarchy. So in 1905, for the first time, Russia finally has a constitutional monarchy. And so that's a result of the October Manifesto, and you have a state Duma. Now, it wasn't very constitutional. The Tsar still had like veto power and that sort of thing. Now, World War I finally breaks Russia, and you've got two revolutions in Russia in 1917. First of all, you've got the March Revolution that you set up the provisional government, that Russia was setting up like a representative democracy on the model of Western European countries without a czar. Tsar Nicholas abdicated at this time. And so that is in March of, or I think February, March, depending on what calendar you're using. And then the provisional government kept trying to fight World War I, which if you're trying to get a new government going, you don't want to do that in the middle of a war. So the provisional government was trying to, try to solidify government, but also this was going to be it was also in the other sense going to be a problem with the war. Okay, so then the Bolshevik Revolution, the October-November Revolution. The October-November Revolution, this is in terms of this is the actual communist Bolshevik Revolution. And this is where, Lenin actually takes power, okay? Now, what you want to note here is he starts off with what's called war communism. Now, war communism was basically we're going to try to go full on communism. Now, Lenin's government gets out of the war, signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which basically gave away a bunch of land on the Russian frontier, which is later going to become the basis for Poland, Romania, and some of the Bulgaria, some of these other places that are being carved out, okay, that during in the Treaty of Versailles with self-determination of peoples. So the Bolsheviks get out of the war, but Lenin first tries war communism. We're going to try to, have this full-on communism, and it doesn't work out that well. Surprise, socialism doesn't work. Lenin's like, whoa, okay, the socialism thing is not working, and, full on at least. So he backs off a little bit and goes into the NEP, the New Economic Policy. Okay, so the new economic policy, was that Lenin and his government were going to allow small-time capitalism, not control of heavy industry or anything like that, but small-time capitalist enterprises. So the government wasn't going to try to control every aspect of the economy. Now later, Stalin revoked the NEP. Okay, Stalin went back on the NEP, but Lenin, the NEP was a measure in order to try to make things work, and so people were able to have their small-time capitalist ventures. Okay, now as far as that goes, Sajeev, okay, you're asking a lot of very general, non-specific questions. I'm going to kind of go and see if I've got something here. Okay, so we see here what are some of the best examples of imperialism slash colonization. So if we're looking for some illustrative examples, for example, of the new imperialism, Let's note the Berlin Conference. Okay, we want to associate the Berlin Conference with the new imperialism. That there are, that there are several countries getting together in order to basically figure out what are we going to do in Africa, okay? How can we make this to where there's as little conflict as possible? Now, if we want to look at, now another person to know for imperialism, the new imperialism, is Sir Cecil Rhodes, who was, a very big supporter. He was a businessman, very rich guy, but a big supporter of British imperialism, and also the founder of the Rhodes Scholarships, okay? So the Rhodes Scholarships are basically, scholarships for young people who want to study in England. They can go to Oxford and they can study. And a lot of those people, the United States gets more Rhodes scholarships than any other country in the world. And this kind of goes back to, if you think about nationalism, it's on the basis of language. Sir Cecil Rhodes had this dream that basically we can bring the United States back into the British Empire, that the United States and Britain will be like one country again. And so what needs to happen is the best and the brightest need to go study at Oxford. Now, Bill Clinton, for example, was a Rhodes Scholar. And so when you think about it, like when you've got a president who's gone to Oxford to study, and that person gets elected president of the United States, what we're seeing there is obviously, that person is going to not have a foreign policy that is not good to the British, right? That person's going to have a very pro-British foreign policy. Okay, Sir Cecil Rhodes. Okay, so Cecil Rhodes. Okay, so Sir Cecil Rhodes was somebody. Now, the other thing is he's kind of controversial because, like a lot of people at that time, he was racist. And so there are controversies over whether there should still be a Cecil Rhodes statue at Oxford and stuff like that, even though here's a guy that was like a very big benefactor at that time. But he does have kind of a, a checkered legacy because a lot of people are, not fans of, late 19th, early 20th century imperialism today. So then, if you want like the worst example of imperialism, you might want to note the Belgian Congo, okay, where King Leopold of Belgium, which Belgium, it's not a very powerful country, is it? They've got, when you get old enough, they're known for their beer. They're also known for their chocolate, if you'd like for the Belgian chocolates. But, people, Belgium is a wonderful place to visit. It's somewhere that's great, and especially if you know a little bit of Dutch, but they know a good bit of English as well. So it's a great place to visit, but it's not a very powerful country. So King Leopold of Belgium was basically able to run the Belgian Congo however he saw fit. And he's his people are cutting people's hands off if they don't hit their, their rubber quota and stuff like that. Okay, so yes, exactly, Jenna, that now he didn't personally chop off people's hands, but there are people that are cutting off people's hands there. So yeah, King Leopold in the Belgian Congo, that would be an illustrative example of some of the worst abuses of imperialism, and maybe not indicative of imperialism as a whole, but certainly the worst of it. Okay, so with that, we'll go ahead and mark that question as answered. All right. Now, with that, can I go over the breakup of Yugoslavia? Okay, so as far as that goes, that Yugoslavia, when you think about it, there are people who say I am Polish, or I am a Czech, or I am a Slovak, or I am a Ukrainian. There are people who, they declare a nationality. Nobody ever says I'm a Yugoslav. Okay, that's what I am. Okay, now there are lots of Slavic peoples out there. Sometimes Slavic people get along with each other. Sometimes they hang out together. They're friends. But at the same time, Yugoslavia had all of these, Wilson comes in. He's self-determination of peoples. And so then it's well, there are all these little groups that, press F to pay respects to Yugoslavia. That's a great idea. Let's create, because we have all these little groups of people around here, let's create this one country and call it Yugoslavia. Now, during the Cold War, they were led by a guy named Tito, T-I-T-O, and Tito was a communist dictator, but in the late 1940s, he broke with the Soviet Union. He was like, I'm not, I'm not going to be beholden to the Soviets. I think he even got a little Marshall Plan money from that. And so, but before the fall of communism, Yugoslavia was governed by communist dictators. And as long as that was the case, you didn't have a lot of people fighting each other. But as soon as communism fell, you've got this, this country that has all of these different ethnic groups of people that hate each other, and they've got all these different religions, which the Bosnians are Muslim, the Serbs are Orthodox, the Croatians are Catholic. And so you've got all of these different groups here, which if you've ever met somebody from Bosnia, I mean, it's like you've got like, redheaded, blue-eyed Muslims. There are a couple people that I've known from Bosnia, and it's, it's really interesting. Malcolm X in his autobiography talked about his pilgrimage to Mecca and how for the first time, he saw like these, these white European Muslims who were going along in his pilgrimage to Mecca. So with that, you've got several like wars that are fought there, which these are not continental wars, but, Yugoslavia, definitely they brought in UN peacekeepers and all that. I would not say that you're going to see a lot of that on the exam. Now, watch that be like the, like the DBQ or something like that. But as far as that goes, we want to note here. Now, let me check the boundaries of the DBQ again. AP Euro, let's see, Euro course description. Okay, so let me just let's see, the document-based question. Okay, so the document-based question begins, it's okay, so 1600 to 2001. So technically, you could have a DBQ on Yugoslavia in the 1990s, but then again, if it's the DBQ, then what you're going to see there on the DBQ is that, you don't necessarily need to know a lot about it in order to get it right, okay, in order to get it right. And so as far as that, I think that, it's not something I'm an expert on, that I'm necessarily an expert on, but going from there. So I'm going over the breakup of Yugoslavia into, today you've got Croatia, you've got Bosnia, you've got Kosovo, you've got Serbia. So basically, it's really, it shouldn't have ever been put together in the first place like that, because you had all of these different ethnic groups. But then again, Wilson goes in and it's like, oh, let's redraw the map of Europe when we don't know anything about, Slavic peoples and Eastern Europe. All right, so going from there, let's go ahead and think in terms of let's see. Now, one thing that I will say about religion in the 20th century is World War I in some ways kind of had a polarizing effect, that there were a lot of people after World War I, you start to see, of course, like Dada, the art movement after World War I that is basically about nonsense. A lot of people are doubting rationality. A lot of people are doubting religion, in the sense that if there's a God, why would this sort of thing happen? Now, other people, like if you think, which the J.R.R. Tolkien biopic should be coming out this month. I'm not sure if it's out yet, but J.R.R. Tolkien was a World War I veteran, and was if anybody's ever read Lord of the Rings or seen the movies, there are a lot of Catholic undertones there. So you got people like from that generation, like J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. There are in some circles like very much a revival of Christianity, but in other circles we start to see that like different philosophies such as existentialism. We want to note that like existential philosophy becomes more of a thing among intellectuals. And of course, you look at France today, for example, that the majority of French people self-identify as Catholic, but also there's about 30% of the country, 25 to 30% of the country that identifies itself as irreligious. So irreligious, and in a lot of cases, I mean, France has a good many atheists per capita. So going from there, I would say that we want to note the influence of existentialism, and Jean-Paul Sartre is a great person to have there. When you think about Jean-Paul Sartre, who was an existentialist, who became very popular after World War II. He was a philosopher, he was a playwright, wrote a lot of books, and existentialism is a humanism. All right, so yes, I'm looking forward to a year of AP US history, ladies and gentlemen. that's going to be awesome. Okay, so the important Soviet leaders. Okay, so Sophia, we want to note, like with Stalin, okay, I'm going to go over a few things here. Okay, Stalin, you've got, first of all, socialism in one country. Remember that Lenin, was still part of this idea that there needs to be a worldwide communist revolution, that we need to have, it needs to spread, that this communist revolution doesn't need to just be here. But Joseph Stalin's thinking in terms of, we want the rest of the world to recognize us. Let's focus on here. So what he said, socialism in one country, that he renounced the goal of a worldwide communist revolution. And of course, that sort of previews Stalin's nationalism in World War I. Remember that communism as a philosophy is inherently internationalist, okay? That it is very hostile to nationalism. But Stalin in World War II, of course, we should be seeing tomorrow, the parades. Now, VE Day is tomorrow in Europe, the Victory in Europe Day from World War II. And so that's going to be pretty awesome to see those parades that we're going to see, because the Russians, they have like this full military parade, on that day. And of course, they're celebrating what Stalin turned into a national war, okay, a war about nationalism. And so with that, okay, so with that, Stalin, is open to nationalism. Now, also, Stalin's the guy that was responsible for the Gulags and the terror and the Holodomor, which Stalin, intentionally starved millions of people in Ukraine. And, this is something that was very much a tragedy. And I think that categorizing that as a genocide would not be too harsh, because this is something that you've got this intentional starvation of people. Now, the kulaks, which I believe comes from a Russian word meaning fist, if I'm not mistaken, that it means fist. And this is like, basically, he's categorizing these people as greedy. These were people, the kulaks, these were land-owning farmers who did not want to submit to collectivization of agriculture, because that's what Stalin was trying to do. Was he was trying to get people to voluntarily consent to the collective farming. And the kulaks are like, they're not, they're yeeting on the collective farming, and they didn't want to do that. And so Stalin's like, well, you know what, I'll just intentionally starve these people to death. And so that's what happens there. Now, going from there, we would go to Khrushchev, who was, of course, de-Stalinization is part of Khrushchev's policy. Khrushchev, upon taking office, gave his so-called secret speech, okay, his secret speech where he denounced Stalin's cult of personality, because that's another thing about communism, is the whole idea of a cult of personality, where this individual leader is set above everyone else. That that's kind of against like the tenets of doctrinaire socialism. And so with that, yeah, you're not necessarily going to find a lot of economic clout in the Soviet Union, Ariana, but I'll see if I can find a way to mention that. And so, with Khrushchev, you got that. Also, Khrushchev, you got the Berlin Wall, peaceful coexistence with the West. Then we go to Brezhnev. Now, Brezhnev, remember the Brezhnev Doctrine, which I've already addressed in this review session previously, okay? The Brezhnev Doctrine in response to the Prague Spring, that the Soviets will intervene there. Now, then you go to the next major leader was Gorbachev. Now, Gorbachev in the 1980s, he saw how messed up the system is. And he's like, what can I do to save it? Okay, what can I do to save the system? And so what he came up with are some reforms, some somewhat liberalizing reforms of glasnost and perestroika. Okay, glasnost and perestroika. Now, remember, the way we remember those is glasnost means openness. I tell people glasnost, okay? You say glasnost because glass, you can see through it. So openness. We're going to allow, Gorbachev's like, look, we're going to allow people to criticize the government, because in allowing criticism, so he's opening up to a very liberal idea that, in order, when we allow people to criticize the government, then, we can see weaknesses in the government. And when we're seeing weaknesses in the government, then we can fix those weaknesses. But instead, said, so now perestroika was restructuring. Glasnost and perestroika, these are, two things that Gorbachev is doing. So, that is, well, I would just say perestroika is restructuring, okay? I wouldn't get too more deep into it besides understanding glasnost and perestroika, okay? So going into that, be careful about the Princeton Review on the DBQ and LEQ prompts. They are not in line with the current exam prompts. I can't say anything about the multiple choice, which I haven't evaluated, but yes, do not use the Princeton Review prompts. Go find like some College Board released items like the 2018 exam from last year. If you are writing the Princeton Review prompts, you are wasting your time, okay? So I would not recommend that book. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, it's too late to get a hold of this now, but Chris Freiler's AP Achiever. Make sure to tell your friends who are taking this next year, Chris Freiler's AP Achiever. That is the book that I recommend because Chris Freiler knows this exam. Okay, so with Gorbachev, glasnost, and perestroika. Now, what happened is, I don't know. I can only comment on what I've seen, and that's all I can comment on. So glasnost and perestroika, which actually accelerated the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, another thing that accelerated the fall, particularly of the Eastern Bloc, is Gorbachev renounced the Brezhnev Doctrine. So Gorbachev said the Soviet Union is no longer going to intervene if a liberalizing government takes power. And so with that, that's when you see the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany. So as far as that goes, I don't know. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if y'all will listen to me, the only two things I say about prep books are that I recommend Chris Freiler's AP Achiever. The other thing that I'll tell you is the Princeton Review, DBQ and LEQ prompts are no good. Other than that, I have no comment about any prep book. Okay, those are the only two things that I'll tell you about prep books because that's that's all I know, and I'm not going to talk about stuff that I don't know. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about stuff that I don't know. Thank you so much. All right. So with that, let me go ahead and, I've already kind of talked about the Cold War. Let's talk about Margaret Thatcher and Thatcherism, okay? So Margaret Thatcher, ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Thatcher was, elected. She was the first, I believe, the first female head of government, like elected female head of government in European history. And when you look at Thatcher, like the irony is that Thatcher was a conservative. She was somebody now. Also, very much when we think about, as far as the weight of the exam, what Jenna's saying here, now the multiple choice is 40%, SAQ 20%, DBQ and LEQ 40%. Of which the DBQ is the lion's share of that. DBQ makes up 25% of your exam total, and the LEQ makes up 15% of your exam total. So Margaret Thatcher, okay, so she's elected. One thing that we want to note is her relationship with labor unions, which was, she came to power after what was called the Winter of Discontent, where it was a very cold winter where they had a lot of strikes, okay? So a cold winter with a lot of strikes, and public opinion had largely turned against labor unions. So Margaret Thatcher took on the British labor unions. And then she was a very big advocate of economic liberalism. Now remember, economic liberalism is about low taxes, deregulation, a small public sector. So she started to deregulate and privatize several British industries. Okay, so Margaret Thatcher, economic liberalism. Also a big, friend of Ronald Reagan, which they had a lot of the same stuff. She was big on fighting the Cold War. Also, speaking of war, that she became, got a boost in her popularity after she fought the Falklands War, that basically Argentina tried to take back these Falkland Islands, which belonged to Britain. And Britain, took back the islands, and that made, Margaret Thatcher called what they call a snap election with that, okay? So as far as that goes, Thatcherism, we want to think now also social conservatism, that she was somebody that was very much for traditional families, not a fan of same-sex, marriage or anything like that. Not that any mainstream party was advocating for that in the 80s. Then the final thing we would note is that Margaret Thatcher was a notable Euroskeptic. Okay, so when it came to whether Britain would join the European Union, she gave her speech about, like, will Britain yield its national sovereignty? No, 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 she said. And so, you know, her successor, John Major, came from the more like, you know, Euro-friendly part of the party, but that's still something that is a legacy today. If you think about Brexit, that there is this wing of the Conservative Party that is Eurosceptic, that they don't want Britain in the European Union, okay? They don't want Britain in the European Union, you know, they want to kind of get out. Now, Britain never really joined the European Union fully. You know, everybody's, you know, making a big deal out of Brexit, but was Britain ever like totally in the European Union? They're not in the Schengen area. Like, if any of you've ever traveled between Britain and Europe, you know, you know that you have to go through customs, whereas if you're traveling from the Netherlands to France, then you don't have to go through customs. Like, you just get off of your plane and that's it. Whereas if you're traveling between Britain and Europe, then you have to go through customs. So they're not in the Schengen area. They don't. They have the pound. They have their own currency rather than the euro. So when it comes down to it, what you should you know, what you should have, you know, I mean, as far as that goes, was Britain ever part of the European Union in the first place? Their plugs are different. Like, their electrical outlets are different than European outlets. Like, from France to Turkey, they've got the same outlets, and in Britain they've got a different type of outlet. The British still use, you know, colloquially, maybe not officially, but colloquially still use miles, feet, pints, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so it's like Britain is not really European, like when you think about it. So it's like this Brexit thing is so overblown. Like, have they really ever been part of the European Union? Yeah, that and then they speak English. Like, you know, 1984, for example, George Orwell puts them in the same, like, you know, totalitarian state. Remember, the world was divided into 3 totalitarian states. Britain's not part of Europe. It's basically in a state with with the Americas. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, the Decembrist revolts, we want to note that was a revolt, a military officers' revolt against the Tsar. Basically, when one Tsar took power and the military supported his brother, and basically that was put down very harshly. Now, that's a causal factor when you think about the repression of the Decembrist revolt, when you're looking for, like, why didn't Russia have a revolution of 1800? Why did Russia, or 1848? I'm thinking push right now. They're both this week. So why didn't Russia have a revolution of 1848? And the Decembrist revolt is part of that. Okay, so with that, I would note that's basically it happened in Russia. It was a repression of a rebellion against the military, which was preferring someone else to become czar. All right. So going on with that, I've already talked a little bit about the former Yugoslavia and all that. I don't know. It's one of those things, most classes aren't even going to get to it. And I haven't seen it as a big item on the test yet, but you never know. Okay. But I don't really tend to get into current events when I'm doing these things, and which is basically the way I look at stuff from the 90s on, seems to be current events. All right. So going on from that. Okay. So the European Union and exactly what it is. Okay. So you began with basically World War II. Okay, before World War II, Europeans were constantly killing each other. It's like they're addicted to war. And so what's going to happen there? That you start to see, like, of course, there's the Cold War, the formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact and all that. But the European Union began as the European Economic Community. Okay, so the European Economic Community, was getting together basically as a tariff-free zone. When you have basically West Germany, France. Let's see, when we look up the European Economic Community. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen with you for just a second. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and let's see. So going in, we're going to screen share, and okay. So the European Economic Community, okay, so the original members of the European Economic Community, you've got here, now Britain ends up joining it later, but when we think about the creation, now as far as that goes, we see that, let's see, So when we see initially the European Economic Community, it was originally West Germany, France, Italy, and the Benelux countries, okay, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, okay, so it was originally a very like small group. Looks like, okay, Austria joins later, but it started off as a very like small group in Western Europe: Italy, France, West Germany, and Benelux. Now later on you see that it grew quite a bit, and that is one of the communities there. Now the European Union, okay, so the European Union basically came about after the fall of the Soviet Union. Okay, so this is the first like real like political union of Europe. So what began as an economic union becomes a political union. And that was established by the Maastricht Treaty. And that was, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, ratified in 1993. Okay, so that's something, yeah, the Treaty of Maastricht, that is November of 1993, so only a couple of years after the fall of the Soviet Union. And the European Union, there are a couple of things there, okay? First of all, there is the economic union, that there are no tariffs in the European Union. All of these countries have a free trade policy between these countries. And so it's an economic union, so no tariffs, free trade, also a free movement of peoples, at least in the Schengen area. Now, there are a few countries like the British that are outside of the Schengen area, okay? So, so as far as that, Schengen area, so you have the free movement of peoples, but the British, they've got a special arrangement where they check, okay? So the British have a particular kind of thing here, and we've got a few members of the European Union. It looks like here that, you know, as the European Union grows, of course, it has some problems because not all of these countries necessarily have similar economic development and such. But if you look at Romania and Bulgaria, they're not technically in the Schengen area, but they are, it looks like they're obliged to join it. Now, you notice that Britain is not part of the Schengen area. Neither is Ireland. That's interesting. I didn't realize that Ireland was not part of the Schengen area. And so that's basically, as far as that goes, there are some EU members that are not part of the Schengen area. So understand that it's the economic union, free movement of peoples, and some common regulations. So some things like with GMOs and stuff like that. So it is a legal union that you've got going on there. All right. So ladies and gentlemen, with that, I'm going to about to sign off here because we've been going for nearly an hour, and I've got some other broadcasts tonight. But it has been a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, make sure that you eat something. Make sure y'all get some sleep tonight. Don't pull an all-nighter, even though I'd love it if I benefit personally if you binge watch my broadcast, but don't do that. Get some sleep tonight at some point. Wake up tomorrow and be refreshed for the exam. So, ladies and gentlemen, I did some rapping. Okay, fine. I'll one more time. Let's get this bread. Okay, so I'll do the Metternich Rap again. Okay, because some of y'all weren't here last night. What up, Europeans? It's the ladies' pick. Austrian Prince Clemens von Metternich, aristocracy savior. I'm the man of the hour. Gonna carefully restore Europe's balance of power. Eating nationalists for breakfast, liberals for my dinner. Gotta be conservative if you want to be a winner. I'm the coach man of Europe, so you better hold your horses because all the great powers are about to join forces. Napoleon thought he was too big for Elba, so we put him on a boat straight to St. Helena. Threatened European peace, so we set him adrift. Shake the French Revolution off like Taylor Swift. Come on, Talleyrand, have a seat at the table because Europe needs a France that is strong and stable. I don't need to punish France. I just want to keep order and restore the old 1791 borders. The liberals have ideas that they want to express, but I shut their mouths up when I censor the press. Stability between and within European states is the goal of this order that I'm trying to create. So join me in Vienna where a Congress is in session. Together we can stop the revolution from progressing this conservative order. No, it ain't gonna fall because I build coalitions like Trump builds walls. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, Metternich Rap, make sure, get some sleep tonight, go into the exam with confidence. Remember, ladies and gentlemen,